listener production.
Hey, Sasha Barbagat with you. Welcome to The Briefing. There is a humanitarian crisis that is deepening right now in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Millions of people have been displaced, and since the beginning of the year, we've seen hundreds of thousands more forced to flee. But why has it received little to no coverage here in Australia?
Congo is the victim of, if not an international conspiracy, at the very least of neglect.
Why the Congo seems to have slipped from our collective consciousness and the covert role a model global citizen is playing in all of it. That's coming up in the second half of this episode. First, it is time for the headlines with Chris Spyrou on Thursday, the 27th of February.
Morning, Sash. Morning, everybody. Peter Dutton is being called on to release the minutes from Shadow Cabinet as his share trading during the global financial crisis continues to be scrutinised. A reminder, this all stems from a series of shares he purchased in 2009 at record low prices in Westpac, NAB and Combank, shares he purchased one day before the government announced a mammoth $4 billion bailout for those banks. The purchases were first brought to light by News Corp earlier this week. Now, former Chief Economic Advisor under the Rudd government, Labor MP Andrew Charlton, told the ABC his jaw fell to the floor when he learned of Dutton's actions.
I saw the Australian share market fall by more than 60%, destroying wealth for millions of Australians. And most importantly, I saw every Australian political leader working every single day tirelessly to save Australia and save Australians. But what we now know is that there was one political leader who was not focused on the national interest. That political leader was focused on his own financial interest, and he admitted that today.
For context, this is what Dutton had to say when asked about the shares earlier in the day.
I think a lot of astute investors would have been buying bank shares at that time because they saw value in the shares, and the balance sheets of Australian banks are very important to them, and obviously I saw value in those shares. So.
He went on to accuse the government of shopping around the story to multiple news outlets, some of which he said flat out refused to run the story. Whether that's true, who knows? And when pressed on whether he would release the Shadow Ministry papers, he said that was, quote, ancient history, before adding that he has always worked with integrity.
I actually think the Australian public wants somebody who knows how to manage money, knows how to manage the economy. I've demonstrated that as Assistant Treasurer. I've conducted myself with integrity at all times. And if the Prime Minister has a claim to make, why doesn't he get up and make it? Because he's weak, he's out of his depth as Prime Minister, and that's the matter.
Yeah, so this is pretty interesting because Peter Dutton has pretty much been on the front foot throughout this whole unofficial election campaign. We haven't started yet, remember? The firing gun has not been fired.
Yep.
And look, this story has put him in a position that he wouldn't have wanted to be in. Now, adding to that, on top of this shares question, is a revelation that came out yesterday that he bought $30 million worth of property over the last 35 years. Now, that's according to 9 newspapers, which claims some of these transactions were declared late, partially or not at all on the parliamentary register.
I've been successful in business, and I actually think that's a good attribute.
Yeah, so these revelations make him one of the country's wealthiest ever contenders for the job of Prime Minister. And inevitably, as we just heard in that grab there, this wouldn't be the image that he would have wanted to portray to the Australian public as he's fighting an election on cost of living, on people doing it tough, on people not having enough money to be able to go to the doctor or buy their groceries. Now he's had to kind of twist it into this way of saying, I'm a good economic manager, look at all the success I've had. And look, there's nothing illegal about or wrong about a politician owning homes. They're allowed to buy shares in certain things, but the questions that remain should be answered. I said this yesterday. They should be answered because he wants to be the Prime Minister and he should have no problem answering those questions.
Yeah, and I mean, Peter Dutton has always come out to say that he will do what's best for the country and he'll be guided by what the country wants and needs. I guess the allegation now that a lot of Labor MPs are coming out to say is that this is a man who's going to continue giving tax breaks to those who are not the everyday Australian. He's going to give tax breaks and incentives to people who are similar to him and have an incredible portfolio, which, again, kudos to him. Well done, he's managed to do it. But the way that the cost of living crisis has played out, it's a very different Australia that we're looking at now, and young people can barely get their foot in the door. So something like this really stings. And if his policies start to reflect, exactly these accusations that are being made, it's not going to leave a lot of people happy.
The parents of a Queensland girl have been sentenced to 14 years in jail after withholding insulin from the diabetic, causing her death. The body of 8-year-old Elizabeth Struhs was found at their home in Toowoomba in January of 2022. Her parents, Jason and Kerry Struhs, were found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced by a judge yesterday, who told the court Elizabeth's death remains profoundly disturbing, if for no other reason that it was so entirely and easily preventable.
Today we got justice for Elizabeth.
That was the girl's sister, Jade, speaking there outside court yesterday. The couple had become members of the extreme religious cult The Saints, which believed God would heal Elizabeth of her diabetes and that she didn't need medicine. 11 other members of The Saints were also sentenced yesterday, all of them receiving jail terms ranging from 6 to 9 years. Among them, the cult's leader, Brendan Stevens, who was described by Justice Burns as a dangerous and highly manipulative individual who led the campaign within the church to convince the girl's dad to withdraw his daughter's insulin. Stevens was handed a 13-year sentence. Both he and Elizabeth's dad were also accused of murder, but were acquitted of that charge.
Yeah, and we did deep dive this story because it was just so harrowing and one of those stories that I think gets people's attention because it involves a cult and just how powerful and manipulative these can be on families. So if you want to have a listen to that episode, that is going to be in the show notes for you.
We found out how much our private health insurance premiums are going to go up by this year. The Health Minister confirming policyholders will be slugged an average of 3.73% more from April 1st, after asking insurers to go back to the drawing board multiple times after being dissatisfied with how much they wanted to increase our costs by. The Minister is responsible for approving the annual premium rises, which will impact more than half of the population who have some form of private health insurance.
Yeah, Labor had been hoping to avoid a cost of living headache on the eve of the election. Mark Butler has described the approved hike, though, as justified and proportionate. I think this is the best he could do. But the coalition is claiming it as a failure by the government to protect us from more price pain. Now, the 3.73% price rise is below health inflation, but it is above household inflation. So at the end of the day, things going up on when you're already kind of on shaky ground isn't what you'd like. But, it seems like every year the health insurers go, we're doing our best to make sure you don't have to pay too much more. It's not the news anyone with private health insurance wants.
No, and since being booted from my parents' private health insurance.
About time. You're a grown man.
I know, I've been booted, and then I was contemplating re-enrolling in uni because I think that's an exception. You can still remain on the policy if you're a uni student, but there's no degree that I want to do at the moment. So
well, I'm glad,
I'm ruling that out.
We'd like you to stay here, so please don't go do uni.
And after going on a tirade against women's sport on his Drive radio show, Marty Sheargold has been let go by Triple M. The comedian copped immediate backlash, including a campaign against him on TikTok, after comparing the Matildas to Year 10 schoolgirls and saying he'd rather hammer a nail through the head of his penis than watch the upcoming Asian Cup.
In a statement released last night, SCA confirmed there was a mutual decision to part ways, effective immediately. Sheargold also commented, apologising directly to the Matildas and saying he understood the gravity of his comments.
So we're playing in the She Believes Cup.
Oh, she believes in what? It better be men.
Now, a number of sporting bodies have responded to Sheargold's original comments. Football Australia condemning them, labelling the words unacceptable and saying they diminish the extraordinary achievements of our national team. We've also heard from the Tillies coach, Tom Samani, who described the words as outrageous and disappointing and that they crossed the line. And just a note, the Matildas are playing this morning against Colombia at 11:30 Australian Eastern Daylight Time. I know I will be getting behind them.
Oh, me too. And I think this game against Colombia seems to be almost like a guaranteed win. We haven't had great results in the She Believes Cup so far. We've already lost to Japan 4-0. We've also lost to the US 2-1. Colombia also lost to both those countries. So we're in for a good chance here. So I really hope our Tillies can turn it around.
Absolutely. Go the Tillies. We're behind you. All right, Chris, thank you. Next up, we are getting into your deep dive, asking the question why Australia is ignoring what's going on in the Congo.
Have you heard about what's going on in the Democratic Republic of Congo? Well, it's Africa's second largest country by size, and according to the UN, more than 5.8 million of its citizens are currently displaced. and they're displaced at the hands of several ongoing armed conflicts. The resource-rich nation with a colonial past is no stranger to poverty and political instability, but it's the fighting in the country's east that's catching the most attention, everywhere but the west. According to the country's Prime Minister, the Congolese army is locked in a bitter battle with Rwanda-backed rebels, a battle that's resulted in several territorial losses and at least 7,000 deaths. And to continue painting a bit of the picture, around 90 displacement camps have been destroyed, leaving 450,000 people without shelter and reliable flows of food, water and medicine. Rwanda denies any involvement, but the UN Security Council just last week ordered them to stop their support and immediately withdraw their troops from Congolese territory. It marks a major escalation in the nation's east and has sparked fears of a regional war, as both sides continue fighting over power, identity, and of course, resources. But why exactly is a seemingly model international citizen funding rebels who are wreaking havoc along its border, and why aren't we hearing more about it in the Australian media? Emmet Livingstone is a journalist living in the Democratic Republic of Congo, who's previously worked for leading global news agency AFP and Politico Europe. Emmet, welcome to the briefing. Before we get into the particulars of what's going on in the DRC at the moment, do you think there's enough reporting on Africa by Western media?
In a short answer, no. I mean, Africa is an absolutely massive continent, and every country has its own particularities. And often various mixes of cultures and different histories and different issues, even inside individual African countries. So when you're talking about Africa as a continent as a whole and coverage, I mean, it's barely covered. It's covered much more in the French language, I would say, than in the English language. In English, correspondents tend to be based in Nairobi, in Kenya, or in South Africa. So big, more developed English-speaking countries. But what that means is that there are these whole expanses of the continent that are essentially, well, they're undercovered for certain.
What has your experience been reporting on the Congo? You've mentioned that you live there. Tell us a little bit about that.
So my experience has been, it's been fascinating. I hesitate to say that it's been fun because the issues in Congo are so important and so extreme, and there are so many people living in misery. There's no other word for it. This is one of the 5 poorest countries in the world. I think it's about 70% of the population of an estimated of 100 million people who live on about $2 a day. So the needs and just the scale of hardship that you see every day is quite difficult. It's a huge country. It has fantastically large mineral resources. It has the world's largest reserves of cobalt, which is a mineral used predominantly at the moment in the manufacture of electric vehicles, but also it has aerodynamic and military purposes as well. Congo is one of the largest copper producers in the world. On top of that, it has the second largest rainforest in the world, and potentially the rainforest that is recycling the most oxygen into the atmosphere, according to latest studies. So just on kind of every major critical issue of today worldwide, Congo plays an extremely important role, be it climate change, be it the energy transition, or what have you. And then the domestic political context is extremely complicated. You also have what is called a conflict, but if I were asked to give my personal opinion, I would call this a war. You also have a war going on, which threatens to engulf the whole of Central Africa in conflict. So, I mean, it's just endless. And as a journalist, you can't hope to get to everything, but you have the aspiration to be able to cover it as well as possible for an outside audience who isn't necessarily paying attention.
Before we get into the latest conflict, I am curious to know a little bit more about the people that live there. When we speak about global conflicts, often we can dehumanize the people who are very much at the heart of what's going on. What can you tell us about their understanding of what's going on and how they've been reacting to it?
There is a perception that Congo is the victim of, if not an international conspiracy, at the very least of neglect. Many Congolese people draw the comparison to their country with Ukraine. They don't understand why more international attention, and by that I mean more attention from the world powers, from the UN Security Council, isn't being paid to Congo. They don't understand why there aren't more sanctions, and they also don't understand why in the West there isn't more media coverage.
Is it clear-cut to say that the rebels, the M23 rebels, are the bad guys and the Congolese army are the good guys?
I would say no, it's not clear-cut to say that. Both sides commit atrocities, to speak the plain truth. Certainly both sides see themselves as the good guys, which is probably the same in any conflict. If you take the side of the Congolese government, they see the M23 as a straightforward proxy group of Rwanda, which is a neighboring country. They see themselves as being invaded, and with the M23 rebels as pawns, essentially, in the interests of some larger scheme. The M23 itself, which, while it is effectively controlled by Rwanda, it does have an independent history, and the M23 says that it's fighting for various things, but first and foremost is against discrimination against certain ethnic groups, including the one that they represent, which is the Congolese Tutsi community. And then they have various other demands, which are certainly considered legitimate internationally, such as the return of Congolese Tutsi refugees into Congo. It's a complicated question because they've also been trying to broaden their support beyond their traditional base. So they've adopted different rhetorics. And so now they're trying to have a political program that appeals to all Congolese people. And so they are saying that they are fighting against corruption, for example, and they're casting the government in Kinshasa as vicious and corrupt. The Congolese army is by no means perfect. If anything, it's the single largest human rights abuser in Congo. There's virtually no command structure. It's extremely indisciplined. Soldiers aren't paid. There's a huge amount of petty corruption, cases of rape and of looting and so on. And on top of that, the Congolese army is de facto in alliance with militia groups that are often sanctioned under international law. So it's not a pretty picture by any means. And on the other side of the coin, I mean, the M23 is itself a group that has been accused credibly by rights organizations, including the UN, of committing massacres and of also forcibly recruiting children. So if I was pushed to say an answer, I'd say they're both actors at which you can lob serious criticism.
The latest reporting around it is that this main conflict and kind of what's going on more broadly in the country, they're saying it's the worst that we've seen in almost a decade, those reportings and the way that that's being presented to us. Is that true?
Yes, that is true. What is significant about the latest development, and certainly the development over the past perhaps year or two, is the increasing sophistication of this conflict. So when we're talking about the conflict, we're talking about a conflict in essentially in the Kivu, so in North and South Kivu, which are two provinces to the east of the country that border Rwanda. And conflict has been going on there for 30 years, a consequence of the Rwandan genocide. But the way the conflict looked on the ground for a long time was essentially very, very disorganized soldiers against militia groups that had AK-47s that would work sometimes, very, very, or maybe some RPG rockets, very kind of low level, almost guerrilla warfare. What we've seen now in the latest escalation is this is proper modern warfare. You have drone strikes, artillery pieces, tanks on the battlefield. And what that means is that for it's more dangerous. There was shelling of the city of Goma and civilians got shelled. And it's also more unpredictable. It's harder, for example, for humanitarian groups to be able to move around where they have to on the battlefield because they don't know if the road is going to get shelled or if there's going to be a drone strike or something like that. Especially the M23 Rwandan side have access to very sophisticated weaponry. They have precision guided munitions, so they can, from far away, they can just take a pop at, say, a tank and blow it up. They also have surface to air missiles, so mobile anti-air defense systems. So they can take planes out of the sky, they can take helicopters out of the sky, and they can take drones out of the sky. In terms of the intensity of the conflict, it's certainly gotten much worse.
And that intensity is something that we're seeing having real impacts on, the everyday civilians there, with a whole raft of international organizations and humanitarian organizations saying that this is deepening a humanitarian crisis that was already really bad in that country. Just how bad has that crisis become?
It's a very good question. It's very difficult to answer for sure, because since the M23 and Rwanda have taken over Goma and occupied a huge swathe of these eastern provinces, it's actually more difficult to get solid information about what's happening. it's certainly very, very bad. And as you correctly point out, it was already atrocious, and it was considered one of the worst human rights crises in the world. I mean, just around the city of Goma, you had about 1 million people who were in displacement camps that were full of mpox, cholera, violence, especially against women, was completely routine. Now what's happened is that the M23 has forcibly displaced everyone from those camps. They've told people they have to go home. But people don't necessarily want to go home. They don't know what they're going home to if their houses are destroyed. They have no money. They've been, in some cases for years, just completely dependent on food aid and aid for water and medicine. All that is now stopping. So if you have 1 million or more people spreading out over a vast area, it's much more difficult to provide aid to those people, especially when they're in a potential war zone. On top of that, there's a very real risk of the spread of disease. Humanitarians, since the huge escalation in fighting in January, have been operating essentially on skeleton staffs. They've been ramping up a little bit, but they're still not where they need to be. There's a general context of massive aid cuts, which is having a huge impact on the ground. And there's also political issues, to put things plainly, which block them from speaking as plainly as they would like. They are having to work in an area which the government considers to be under terrorist occupation. And so they're worried about having their access cut off. And at the same time, they have to manage their relationship with the M23.
We've seen the UN issue directions and pretty much order Rwanda to stop supporting the rebels and to remove any troops from the region. Why aren't we seeing such strong directions or stronger involvement from countries from the West? Why are we seeing the West kind of putting their hands up in the air and letting this take place?
The reasons are complex and varied. One of them, I think, is just what sometimes people call Congo fatigue. Violence has been going on in Congo for 30 years, and many people in governments have been dealing with issues relatively similar to this, for their whole career. And there's an attitude among some capitals, especially Western capitals, of, as you say, just throw your hands up in the air. There's nothing we can do is going to help anyway. On top of that, Rwanda is something of a donor darling. So Rwanda is a dictatorship, but it's efficiently run. And many people in Western capitals and in Western aid groups have effectively built their career in Rwanda. It's a place where you can get a project going, where it will work, and you can go back and you can say, this is what I've achieved. Unfortunately, in Congo, things are much more complicated and plans don't usually work out the way people think they do. There's a bit of that. And then Rwanda has also very, very cleverly played its hand. This is a tiny, tiny landlocked country, and it's managed to essentially buy itself diplomatic protection. So Rwanda is the second largest troop contributor to UN peacekeeping missions around the world. And on top of that, the Rwandan army, as part of peacekeeping missions, is considered quite serious and quite reliable. And there are Rwandan soldiers in Mozambique where they are involved in a conflict where there are strategic interests at play. So Total has a huge gas project in Mozambique, in the Cabo Delgado province where there's an insurgency, and the Rwandans have deployed there. And making moves like this is diplomatic genius. It means that countries such as France, for example, will think twice before leaning hard on Rwanda. In the West, there's a huge amount of guilt over the Rwandan genocide. Frankly speaking, almost nothing was done to stop the Rwandan genocide. And the government in place at the moment is originally the armed group that put an end to this genocide. And so I think it's politically very difficult in many Western capitals to do anything, because you're going to be faced with this accusation, and the accusation isn't in itself wrong.
It sounds like they've placed themselves, or putting on this front, that they are the model international citizen and doing all these things that we expect of global citizens. But what is their interest in Congo? Essentially, why is Rwanda backing these rebels?
Rwanda doesn't publicly acknowledge that it's involved, although this is a total nonsense, and it's been demonstrated to the highest possible levels of proof. You have drone footage of Rwandan forces in Congo. But when the Rwandan government speak publicly, they talk about having to get rid of militia groups that spread hateful ideology on their doorstep. So they're talking about security reasons, having a sort of security buffer. And that may be true, or it may only be part of the truth. I mean, the context of the Great Lakes region is one of various countries competing for influence and for money in Eastern Congo. Eastern Congo is a huge market for the neighboring countries. It's both It's mainly a market from which resources are extracted, especially gold, which is then smuggled and exported outwards. And certainly events like the capture of Goma raises a question, because there was a school of thought beforehand that they would never do it because it would draw too much attention to themselves and they just want to smuggle the minerals and be left alone. But they did capture Goma, and they did it very consciously. And this has led to speculation that their real aim is regime change in Congo and to install a government that is more pliable to their interests.
Emmet, before we let you go, we know of at least 35 armed conflicts that are taking place in Africa right now, including the Congo, but also places like Ethiopia, Sudan, Mozambique, Somalia, the list goes on. What do you want people listening to this podcast to keep in mind when thinking about Africa and the underreporting of those conflicts?
What I would wish for in people when thinking about African conflicts is that these are often very, very, very complex issues that are the result of decades of policy making, grievances that have gone unaddressed, and so on. I think there's a tendency in the West to dismiss conflicts in Africa as something that this is what people in Africa do. But that's not true at all. I mean, even if you look at Congo, and Congo is a huge country and there's conflicts in various parts of it, there are parts of Congo that haven't seen conflict since almost the founding of the country. I would ask people to look at it in the same way they would look at a conflict in their own country. You have competing interests, competing factions, you have outside influences and so on. And people are often acting very rationally within their own little world, even though on the outside it looks crazy often.
Emmet, thank you so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Thank you very much for having me.
That was Emmet Livingstone speaking with me there. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That is it for now. Before you go, though, we'd love it if you could share this episode with someone who you think might enjoy it. It's a really easy way you can support us and all that we do here at The Briefing. So we're sharing our social posts. Be sure to check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast, and on TikTok and YouTube. Just search Listener Newsroom. And don't forget, we'll be back in your feed today with another interesting deep dive at 3 p.m. But until then, I'm Chris Spyrou. Catch you next time.
Listener.